We thank you, Professor Bromiley, for being here with us. Exchange ideas with someone we cite is amazing. We have we may say an academy that's not so open, and it's so far from the mainstream. These opportunities are essential for us to improve our work and our impact on knowledge and society. And Kent has also been helping us with this. By the way, he's somehow maybe your legacy because of your past work together. Well, thank you on behalf of our research group. I'm sure this meeting will be very fruitful and inspiring. As Kent said, in this group we have experienced professor, but also graduate students and researchers from Brazil and some from Portugal. We have, as agreed, an opening with Fellipe Martins, a young professor and researcher. Your talk will be next. Fellipe is a young researcher that I had the chance to be his supervisor, and he read your book before his dissertation, starting his dissertation. Kent will moderate our session, to which I will hand over and thank him for the initiative to invite you. And we all know that you have a brief talk, and we are trying to exchange information, knowledge with you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Fellipe, did you?
Fellipe, acho que você pode começar.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we have a very special guest, as Professor Serra was saying before. Actually, we have several special guests, but especially Professor Philip Bromiley, along with Professor Kent Miller. And it is an enormous pleasure for us to have you today. I know that you probably have a tight schedule, so fitting us in the schedule, we thank you very much for your time and attention. Professor Bromiley is quite famous within our field, so I don't think he needs an introduction, but I believe Professor Kent Miller can introduce you more, especially because of your special bond in the past. But I would like to start by saying that I had the pleasure of reading, especially one of your books prior to writing my dissertation, and kind of opened my way of seeing strategy. I come from an engineering background where we have a very deterministic standpoint, a very deterministic point of view of the world, and rationality is an unquestionable cornerstone of sometimes of engineering. And your book kind of showed me that we have a different way of seeing the world, and this is the message that I would like to extend to all of the professors and graduate students we have here. Because not necessarily your book, but your book distills pretty much everything that has been said in behavioral strategic management in the past few decades. And I would like to speak a bit about your book before. So I have prepared a slide talking about you, but I think Professor Kent Miller would be more appropriate to introduce you. But I would like to talk a bit about one of your books. This book it was kind of special to me during my formative years. It's the green one called The Behavioral Foundations of Strategic Management. And I cannot urge enough people to read it, especially for those who are starting to understand behavioral strategic management, especially for those coming from other areas, from those who have some interest in understanding the behavioral rationale behind decision making. And I would say that your book has three main reasons to be read for people who have not had any contact prior to, for example, today. First of all, I think it's a very smooth introduction to the theme. And when I say introduction, I was a little nervous to start studying behavior strategy because I did not have the background to understand. And your book pretty much distilled everything that has been said before in a very readable, in a very smooth manner. And I was sold by the first chapter. By the end of the first chapter, I was absolutely sold. And I thought, why did I not understand these things before? Why did I assume that people are machines and they have the most rational frames of mind when deciding things, when that's clearly not true? And I think it's a very smooth introduction. I would like to extend this invitation for people to read your book. Well, the second reason for that is because the literature in our field has become extremely enlarged and refined. Your book kind of brings it all together. And I'm glad to say that it is a very, not only smooth introduction, but is also, it presents in a very specific timeline of events, how the behavioral strategic management has been formed. So by the end of the book, I could have at least a whole understanding of the field and how things were related to each other, and how I could understand how to fit my own theories and my own research in that frame of mind. So not only it gives us a very smooth introduction, but also an overview of the area that is very useful. And the third, and I think that I have to congratulate you on that, because the way you write is amazing. You write in a brilliant form, yet very simple. And people sometimes think that academics have to write in the most, I don't know how to say that, but in a very specific academician way. And you put things so simple in the paper that everybody can understand from the very beginning what you mean and where you're going to. So I would say that it's impossible not to read your book and at least gain a deeper understanding of the area. And fourth, you do begin this book, and I have to say that it's brilliant, by defending the cornerstones of behavioral foundations of strategic management in a way that it's difficult to argue against the way you speak. And probably by the end of the book, everybody who reads it becomes an aficionado on behavioral foundations of strategic management. And to me personally, it's a pleasure, because this book was essential for my development as a researcher, and I believe it will be essential for the development of many of our researchers here in Brazil, specifically in the context of behavioral strategy. And I was reading my notes when I was during doctoral degree, and I found this specific page. It's the page 11 of the book, and this was the argument that sold me. And I never thought differently before seeing this, which is, if we assume firms make optimal decisions, we cannot explain performance differences among firms based on the quality of decision making. Likewise, if we assume firms make optimal choices, then we cannot imagine suggesting ways to improve strategic management. Finally, if industries are in equilibrium, then by definition, management cannot improve the situations without collusion among firms. This sold me, and I thought, well, this is something that's really interesting, something that I should devote myself in the next few years of my life, and I probably in the next few decades as well. So I could speak probably about your book for a long while, because I was very, very impressed by it by then, and I'm still impressed today. Obviously, I know that you have been published in all major journals in the field and in several other topics, not only pertaining to behavioral strategic management. And I'm really glad to have you today. And I can say without any doubt that we are all glad to have the opportunity of listening to you today. So without much further ado, I would like to pass on the opportunity for Professor Kent Miller to conduct the session. And if everybody in the end has any problems or difficulties in translating questions, I'll be available for that. Okay?
Thank you, Fellipe. Phil, I think we're all eager to hear from you, and I'm going to turn everything over to you in just a moment. I think before I do that, let me just say that my relationship with Phil Bromiley goes back to 1987, when I began as a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota at the Carlson School of Management in the Strategic Management and Organization Department. And Phil was actually at that time an assistant professor. He was later promoted to associate professor during the course of my doctoral studies. So we have known each other for a long time, and he was really instrumental in terms of the start of my own career. He and I discovered together a shared interest in risk, and my very first publication was one that we co-authored and published in the Academy of Management Journal together on that topic of risk. When I got to the point of developing my own dissertation, I had this adventuresome idea that I would go back to Latin America and gather data from managers in Latin America. And he was willing to support me in that adventure, and I appreciated that. And so the participation that I have with all of you today is in some sense an ongoing part of my involvement in behavioral perspectives on strategic management, but also my interest in engagement in Latin America. And I just wanted to share with you that Phil, at that critical stage in terms of the development of my own dissertation, was willing to support this proposal to go to Latin America and gather data in that context, to look at aspects of the behavioral theory of the firm, to look at uncertainty and how managers were responding to uncertainty within the Latin American context. So we've had a long-standing relationship. It's always been good, Phil, to reconnect with you. And in the past, that's typically been on an annual basis when we've crossed paths at professional meetings. But it's been a few years now, so it's good to be back together with you. At this point, I'll just turn over the time to you. I know you have some opening comments to make to us, and then we'll open the floor for a discussion and encourage all of you to interact with Phil. Although you could post things into the chat, I guess I would encourage you to speak up and to speak your thoughts as well as your questions when we do get to the time of Q&A. So Phil, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you very much. And let me thank you all for inviting me and saying these kind words. One of the joys of having doctoral students is having students who are smarter than I am, and Kent was definitely one of them. And part of what you try to do is just not get in their way when they're that good. I also had the model of my advisor, who was Herb Simon, and I decided to do something that he thought wasn't what you did, which was I wanted to study process, but also then to do econometrics on the outcomes. And everybody previously had done simulations, and he was willing to put up with it. And part of what you do is you encourage students to do things that you didn't think about. Okay, let me say a little bit, but let me begin by saying, please interrupt. If I'm speaking too fast, if you have any questions, I've been married for 45 years. I'm used to being interrupted. Okay, so please. Let me see if I can share my screen. I think that's... Now, some of this may be, certainly to some of you, you've already seen. So let me go relatively quickly through this. Okay, and what are we really talking about? First of all, we're talking about doing things consistent with what we know about people and organizations and how they actually, what they actually can do. And basically, we can do whatever, study any problem and strategy we feel like. It is not a topic-specific approach. In fact, over the years, I've worked on everything from trust to executive turnover to capital investment, government budgeting, you name it. I get bored. I like to play with different stuff. So now, what does that include? Well, it includes clearly bounded rationality, goals, sequential attention, routines, heuristic search, and adaptation. Now, this is partially my Carnegie bias, and it is biased. There are many other things. One of the important insights from what is called Herb Simon's Towards an Empirical Microeconomics book is that to understand things, you have to understand the problem the manager actually is trying to solve. Often it is not what we thought he was or she was trying to solve. So if you read, for example, Joe Bauer's old book on capital investment, you'll find that the investment decision was important, but it was only one of the many things that people were worried about. And so imposing our assumptions on what they do is problematic. While I do a lot of quantitative work, I think we should almost always talk to somebody who has done it done whatever we're studying before we get out there and start doing too much. Because it may turn out that what they're doing is something totally different than what we thought they were trying to do. So get out and talk to them. That does not mean you have to do strictly qualitative work. It means find out. The example I like to use is that academics talking about decisions when they've never talked about someone who's actually made those decisions is sort of like virgins discussing sex. They're very likely not to understand what's going on and misinterpret it. So it includes also cognition, behavioral agency, structure, contracts, OT and OB, etc. Lots of stuff. Now, what I'm going to take is what Lavallo and Powell and Fox claim, that it's only about cognitive social psychology. Gavetti makes the same mistake in one of his papers. This ignores the whole domain of organization theory. And much of what we do is actually much better. If you think about the level of analysis problem, we are dealing with organizational decisions mostly, not individual decisions. And so the omission of organizations is absolutely horrendous. Gavetti makes the same mistake, and Sid Winters wrote a somewhat complicated rebuttal afterwards. Gavetti claiming that behavioral was all cognition. And while we have an underlying assumption of cognition as an assumption, that doesn't mean the right theory is that at that level. Are you all familiar with the structure of complexity arguments? No, maybe not. Okay, to understand a system at this level, we have to have some assumptions about what's underneath, and they have to be pretty good ones. But we don't have to understand the full system. So I can program in Stata without understanding C, which it's written in. And I can program in C without understanding machine language. So that it's important to sort of keep that level issue. And when we're talking organizations, it's quite possible that what individuals do doesn't actually generalize that easily to organizations. Behavioral decision theory is an individual work. No people in that, no groups in that. And as I mentioned here, most of the work based on prospect theory actually misinterprets prospect theory and claims it makes predictions it does not, without assumptions they do not make, including, by the way, Kahneman and Lavallo's piece. There's a paper I call Looking at Prospect Theory in SMJ that sort of shows what predictions are actually consistent or not consistent with prospect theory. And almost none of the predictions people want to claim are relevant. Anybody wants to talk about that, just break in. Okay, what basic works? Administrative behavior, organizations, Marx and Simon, behavioral theory of the firm. One of the things to note is that most of the intellectual heavy lifting was in organizations, March and Simon. Syrett and March is a much easier book to read. But if you think about the mechanisms, most of them were March and Simon. That then led to actually transactions cost economics. It was Ollie Williamson's dissertation at Carnegie when Simon and March were there. And evolutionary theory. Sid Winters, Dick Nelson, who were assistant professors at Carnegie at that point. And you can think of evolutionary theory as Syrett and March moved to the industry level mostly. I'm going to argue, and I'm afraid those of you who read my book probably already know I'm going to argue this, that if you're going to be rigorous in strategy, you have to be behavioral. That is, if you're not, you're probably making inconsistent assumptions, and it's hard to be rigorous when you're logically inconsistent. The economic foundations people come from assume rationality. Agents optimize, meaning not that they try to optimize, but rather that they do pick the best of all possible alternatives. And Nash equilibrium, which means no actor can improve position acting alone. That, by the way, is simply a definition of a Nash equilibrium, and Nash is the gold standard in equilibria in some sense. Well, the problems with this are pretty horrendous. They basically rule out almost everything we find interesting. This is why if you talk to real economists and you say strategy, they think game theory. In fact, there is a paper in AER by, I think, Shapiro or somebody, the theory of business strategy is game theory. Well, that's kind of weird, particularly since game theorists can't play games very well. The people who actually know how to play games are the cognitive psychologists and the AI people who've made simulations. They're not working out a game theory. Part of the problem here is, again, as Fellipe mentioned, if you assume everybody makes optimal choices, then firm choices just become irrelevant. Our world is only meaningful because some firms make better choices than others. Thank goodness that's what they do. It also means no decision tool can improve performance. By the way, that also implies that business schools are useless as training, because if firms made optimal choices before business schools, obviously we can't improve their decisions. Well, that's pretty crazy. And of course, by definition, firms can't improve their performance if it's an equilibrium. Well, this has a parallel to financial economics, old style financial economics, which the basic big implication is that there are no inefficient capital markets. There are no trading strategies that can beat the market. And this is what, if you remember almost all finance tests of CAPM and market efficiency are essentially trying to see if there are rules that'll beat the market, because the theory says you can't. The problem is, if you really want a theory of beating the market, you can't build it out of assumptions that say you can't beat the market. And obviously there is an alternative, behavioral alternative. And in fact, I argue that in many cases, when you push optimizing people, they fall back on behaviors. Now, some of the things you probably had to deal with, one is, for example, the RBV, which was perhaps the dominant view in strategy for many years. And it was posed by started by Lippmann and Remote as, how do we explain performance differences in equilibrium by rational firms? And the answer was this magic, we're going to draw random production functions. Well, that's not a very useful explanation, right? We're going to explain how rich people are by they draw and won the lottery. Well, that's not a very good explanation of who's rich. It also implied, as Jay Barney has pointed out, that managers cannot understand their resources, because if they fully understood them, they would sell them to somebody else. Everybody would have the resource and it would no longer be valuable. So you can't understand this resource, but you, by the way, are using it optimally. So they're making these kind of crazy arbitrary assumptions. It also implied no rules for riches. Again, this is straight out of their work, because if everybody's rational and information transfers quickly, there can't be rules for riches. Well, thank God, again, people aren't economically rational. They're sensible. They're rational in a common usage, but they're not optimal. And information does not transfer. Anybody who studied information transfer in organizations knows it's pretty damn hard, let alone across organizations. They moved to sustained competitive advantage as sort of a proxy for equilibrium. although exactly what sustained means was never clear. The theory includes the assumption that resources must be valuable. This is in the VIRO or whatever. The problem is the only way you know a resource is valuable, since it can't be traded, is it makes money for you. So there's a tautology there. This thing is valuable because we made money, and we want to use this thing to explain making money. It also is kind of weird because resources are only positive, whereas in the real world, they're good for something. Anything is good for some stuff and bad for others. Think about 3M's resource of innovation. We all know 3M's an innovative company. Well, that goes along with a complete inability to compete in low-cost markets if it doesn't have a technical advantage. So the positive innovation goes with this negative that they're a high-cost producer. And every few years, 3M spins off all its dull old businesses where it doesn't have a technological advantage because it can't compete anymore. They worry about explaining why firms differ, which is sort of weird. It's sort of, how could you ever have two firms that didn't differ? Why is that a problem? If I set up 2 hamburger stands and let them operate for a year, they would be different at the end of the year. You can't make 2 firms identical, let alone 2 big ones. Now, the problem isn't that doing stuff better than the competition can pay off. The problem is these equilibrium and rationality stories that take it too far, which is part of why I developed the practice-based view, or Ricky Rao and I did. So what do you got? Well, firms do things in multiple dimensions. They buy stuff, they sell stuff, they do all kinds of things. Managers make choices, and these interact in markets. So the interaction of markets and firms, customers, influences performance. Obviously, if you do things better than the competition in ways that customers care about, you probably do better profit-wise. But skills transfer, but only slowly. I don't know if you, in the prospect theory, practice-based view paper, I cite some stuff where there's evidence that just having objectives in firms, clear objectives, and evaluating people still explains variance in performance. This is 1950s stuff, management by objectives, yet it still explains variance in performance. So stuff doesn't immediately dissipate. And obviously, we don't have to have managers can't understand them. Now, they probably understand some of the things, not others. Who cares? And so we ended up this practice-based view, which we probably would have never written if the world were dominated by sensible people. But given the RBV domination, we thought it was necessary. So we have the little models in the book. It's kind of a firm, got physical resource. It's got choices. The choices interact with the firm's characteristics, the market, to get outcomes, and then we have feedback. Note that these are characteristics of the whole. It's not that the firm isn't a bundle of resources where we get these little bundles here and this little resource here. No, the firms are integrated organizations, and things influence things. And they may have things they do well and not use them appropriately. And just, people don't necessarily apply their abilities to the most profitable outcome or use it appropriately. And of course, learning becomes quite feasible then in this world. It's very hard in a rational world to think about learning. Agency theory, again, what are the implications? Incentives matter. Well, that's not surprising. The risk response. The problem is that the risk response simply comes directly out of the empirical assumption that managers are risk averse? Well, you make an assumption, you get a very obvious answer. But there's much better work on motivation in org theory, org behavior. And there's more complicated understandings of risk. Inherent in much of this stuff is that there's one risk preference. And what we know is that organizations do not have a coherent risk preference, despite all the risk management literature. There's some wonderful work by McCrimmon and Warehung showing that individuals don't have consistent risk preferences. People who skydive don't necessarily play the stock market, period. And if they were consistent risk preferences, they would. Okay, TCE, again, came out of behavioral, but went far more econ. We're going to have bounded rationality about some things, but by the way, the company knows the optimal org structure. Now, exactly how they knew that, I don't know. They also Williamson set trust to 0. Long ago, I did some papers on basically a TCE definition of trust. And we have a measure that's been widely used of trust. There's, part of the problem is they never test the mechanisms. Simon, for example, has argued that bringing a company into my company, so that merging, could be so that I can control them better, the TCE model. It could alternatively be that they start to identify with my organization. Now, those are two very different mechanisms. And those mechanisms are never tested in the research. So it's easy to produce similar predictions. Okay, so basically I'm going to say that equilibrium rationality in economic rationality, not rationality in the common usage, which means we have reasons we're sensible, are essentially incompatible with rigorous work and strategy. And when you push on people, they tend to go behavioral. And it's just easier to go behavioral from the beginning instead of having a lack of rigor. Now, you may wonder why I'm so aggressive about this. And basically, my entire career, I've had to put up with economists and pseudo-economists. And that rates back to when I was a doctoral student. When I was going to defend my thesis, the economists in the school were saying, "You coming on Friday to give Bromley shit?" Except Herb Simon and Dick Sire turned up, and no one really had the guts to try. But basically, if we're not aggressive, we lose. There have been many cases where you hire one economist in a strategy group, and in 10 years, it becomes an econ department. Minnesota, where Kent and I were at one point, is well on its way, having made that mistake. And they have to be pure economists. You probably don't know what happened. The Northwestern, when I was young, had one of the finest strategy groups in the country. Rafi Amit, Connie Helfat, Margie Pederoff, Berger Warnefeld, and Cynthia Montgomery, all there. They were all driven out because they weren't pure enough economists. Obviously, one went to Harvard, one MIT, a couple of them one to Wharton, they ended up at Dartmouth, a couple to Wharton eventually. They were good people, but they weren't pure enough. So you have to be very careful of that. I think we're becoming much more sensible. Behavioral work was the largest area of papers going to the business policy group a few years ago. We're working across areas. And basically, we're unified by keeping our assumptions sensible. By the way, one minor thing, occasionally you'll hear satisficing is simply optimizing subject to information costs. And that's simply silly. As Arrow pointed out, the information search cost models actually require more cognition. They're much more complicated than maximizing utility models. So so satisficing is I'm looking for a needle in a haystack that's sharp enough to sew. The search cost problem is I search until the expected benefit of a sharper needle is less than the expected cost of additional search, which is a much harder problem. I don't even know how you do it. So satisficing is different than optimizing. I also would say one of the things that we do here is is that we're not starting with economic. A lot of behavioral economics and behavioral finance starts with rationality, equilibrium, and then moves a little bit. And I'm starting over with what do we know about real people and moving a bit to simplify so I can build a model. So we're starting at opposite ends. Part of the problem with a lot of that work is you don't end up with a consistent theory. Behavioral decision theory is not a theory. It's a collection of phenomena and patterns. So you don't have any theory. You have patterns. Well, patterns are okay, but they're not a theory. If you want a logically consistent model of the firm, you got to have sensible assumptions that are consistent with much of what we see. Now, I'm often asked what people should study. And my normal answer is that you don't ask dinosaurs about the future. And I'm a dinosaur. The world is filled with fun things to do. The most fun thing I can imagine is playing with data. I like looking at phenomena and playing with data. I've become less tolerant of referees and not that concerned about theorizing. I'm more interested in what the world's like now. I'd still have to do the other stuff, but I'm not as tolerant as I used to be. But you pick something exciting to you and you study it. Personally, I think there's, the idea of multiple aspirations, multiple goals is becoming more interesting. How goals adapt. I don't think we have much on explaining the level of slack. There's a little bit on what slack influences. There's almost nothing on the firm as a coalition. We have stakeholder theory, which is more of a prescriptive theory, which in fact, its founder, who was at Minnesota, openly said was a derivation of Sired March, but with a sort of ethical spin to it. When you're thinking about research, think about what you've got and what you can do that others can't. When Kent wanted to go to Central America, he had contacts and spoke and was interested in a way that very few of us could do. And that's an advantage, an incredible advantage. So think about what you've got, data access, but always what's exciting, what's fun. Because this should be a joy. And we'll go where you guys think up stuff. I'm the dinosaur. You're inventing the future. I'll keep dabbling. Much of what I do that's different comes from people having ideas, like asking me to play along. But I'm still doing fun stuff. Anyway, so that's what I prepared. Let me just close this. And let's just talk. By the way, half the time when I teach MBAs, I demand everybody come into class with something to say about each part of the readings. And we just discuss what they say, what they're about. And I find I covered 90% of what's in the PowerPoints that way anyway. And I'm not as bored. I don't know if they're bored or not, but I'm not as bored. Anyway, so what's of interest? What are you thinking about? Somebody, I'll cold call if you don't volunteer.
It's amazing. It was amazing. And I think we don't, I think for us, we are in a different culture, in a different environment. Study phenomena phenomena here is different from US and Europe, and we have a lot of things. We have a lot of interesting things. How corrupt firms in Brazil, how companies from England, from US are corrupt in Brazil and not in their countries, and so on. There are a lot of things that we have to study that are different here, and I think there's maybe for the young students, we have a different view. We have most of our open of our listed companies are family owned, family controlled, with someone controlling a lot, even the banks. So there's a lot of differences here that it would be amazing to study, but we have a lot of way to go as well.
Approaching the top of the hour, and,
Okay.
and you've given us a lot of stimulating comments, and I think provoked a lot of our thinking during this time that we have together. I expect that Fernando Serra will want to wrap up and may have some final observations, but before he does so, let me just say that in a couple of your opening comments to us today, you highlighted a couple of things that I think are fairly easy to argue. You argued that we ought to be talking to managers and understanding the managerial problem as the basis for the research that we do. And I think that's a compelling argument. I also think it's a compelling argument to say that we need to be studying organizations and not just simply applying individual level theories as we think about explanations for strategy and related phenomena. I think for me, those two arguments are easily won. Nevertheless, if we look at most of the work in the field, we see negligence on both of these dimensions. And there it is that I think we face the real challenge. The challenge would be, how do we help people develop methods or otherwise see differently the costs and benefits of different kinds of research approaches, such that people are actually encouraged to do this work that you have, I think in a compelling way, argued that we should be doing in the field of strategic management. So I'm not looking for a long response, but just simply reinforcing the fact that there's an issue here that goes beyond just simply making an effective argument to really helping to facilitate how this research can actually be conducted in a way that people could see as being advantageous from a career perspective.
And I think having talked to the people who do it makes it much easier to make a compelling argument. Makes it much easier to present. When people raise questions about, is this really what's out there? You can say, well, I spoke to, and this is what they said about that. That can be very helpful. One thing I forgot to say at the beginning, I wanted to apologize for not being able to speak Portuguese. My linguistic abilities only go to English and French. I'm a Canadian, and I have been to Portugal, but I don't speak it. I wanted to apologize. And Fernando, you?
Thanks for Professor Bromiley. So you're a Canadian?
Hey, yes.
You're a Canadian? From where?
Toronto, Ottawa, mainly
Okay.
Ontario.
So I have a big problem because I work for a company that has a subsidiary in Canada, but in French Canada. I speak French better than English, so it's a big problem. But anyway, I would like to thank you a lot, and I don't know if you imagine how important it is to these young students. There are some of these students from masters and another group doing their doctorate, but it's amazing to have you here, to have someone, as I said, we cite, and someone so open to, and I don't know, maybe you are so close to my ideas and that phenomena and testing things to show instead of okay, I don't know, putting another drop in in a mainstream theory that doesn't have many, that you have to adapt to the phenomena. So I think that's our idea as well, but I know it's hard to publish, but I think you'll have to move this way or we will decline.
It's always hard to publish. One of the great embarrassments of our journal should be that nothing is ever accepted on the first page submission, as if no one ever writes publishable paper, ever. Ridiculous. Anyway, thank you very much for having me. This has been a great pleasure. And if I can be of assistance, you let me know. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very, very much. Yeah, very wow.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Phil. Stay in touch.
Thanks. Bye. See you.
Só colocar isso e agradecer a participação de todos. Nós chegamos a ter 53 participantes num dia de semana, final de semestre, né, para todos, né? Aí não é, quem não é professor é aluno, né? Então está no sufoco também. E deixo a palavra aberta para quem quiser comentar alguma coisa e, de minha parte, fiquei muito satisfeito, empolgado.
Parabéns, Serra e Fellipe, realmente foi sensacional. Eu gostei muito do Phil, né? E agradeço muito ao Kent por nos ter apresentado a ele. Não só a gente já tinha lido os trabalhos dele, mas falar com ele realmente é outra experiência. E quando o Serra fala que essas sessões são muito boas para os nossos jovens estudantes, Serra, elas são muito boas também para os nossos não tão jovens professores, tá? Mas aqui também gostamos muito, tá bom? Obrigado a todos, tá? Sensacional. Obrigado, gente. Um abraço para vocês.
Professor Kent, professor Serra, a gente agradece muito a oportunidade que vocês deram a gente de ter assim, experiências como essa não tem preço e não aparecem duas vezes no nosso...
Fellipe, foi um prazer para mim também. Depois de tanto tempo de não falar com o Phil, foi um prazer, inclusive para mim, e me fez lembrar mais os velhos tempos de conversas quase diárias com o Phil, que deixamos de fazer já há muito tempo, mas foi para mim também um privilégio.